Hi, and welcome everybody. I'm Doris Epstein, co-chair of the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, CIJR for short. Today's important presentation focuses on the growing danger of NGO-led campaigns that are attempting to delegitimize Israel under the guise of human rights advocacy. We will examine how these non-governmental organizations are creating narratives that demonize Israel and use international platforms to push their anti-Israel political agendas. And we'll find out how to combat this. We have two very distinguished experts with us. Professor Gerald Steinberg is founder and president of the NGO Monitor. Founded in 2002, it's an independent, internationally recognized research institute that exposes the abuses and power of anti-Israel, anti-Semitic NGOs in government, on campuses, at the UN, and even in corporations. His op-ed columns have been published worldwide. Professor Fred Krantz is a historian, an expert on Middle East affairs, and he is the founder and director of the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research. But first, a few words about CIJR. It began well over 35 years ago in response to rampant anti-Semitism in Montreal campuses. The group of professors, headed by Professor Krantz, began organizing speakers, publications, conferences, writing, doing everything and anything they could to combat the anti-Semitism and biases against Israel. It's a goal that, unfortunately, that continues to this very day, and with even greater urgency. Through CIJR's publications, such as the Daily Briefing, you can be certain to find in-depth, fact-based analyses of Israel, stories, news, events that you will never see on mainstream media. CIJR is a not-for-profit organization. Our work with students and for the Jewish people and for Israel is entirely dependent on your donations, on your tax-free donations. And now, get ready. Demonizing Israel, how to combat the NGO's weaponization of human rights.
Thank you, Doris, for that nice introduction. I'm delighted to be here with Gerald Steinberg, who runs a sister organization that parallels what we do in some ways and reinforces it in others. The topic today of NGOs, of course, is a specific topic, but it has a general, extremely important consequence. We live in an era of rampant and reestablished anti-Semitism. I would submit that our seminar today is crucial because it comes in the context of a new phenomenon, a fairly new phenomenon, which is the use of human rights language to destroy human rights. The use of the language of genocide to apply it to the group which is not genocidal, while protecting the truly genocidal. So we have an upside down phenomenon here, which is fairly new, not entirely. If you look at the long history of anti-Semitism, starting with the Greeks, moving to the early Christians, and down into medieval, early modern Christianity, nationalist anti-Semitism with the growth of states in Italy in the 15th and 16th century, in Northern Europe in the 17th and 18th, political anti-Semitism, and finally, through the new science, the development of racial anti-Semitism. So for earlier anti-Semitism, Jews could be punished, they could be disciplined for being supposedly the killers of God in the form of Christ. For later anti-Semitism, Jews were a problem because how can you have a national state when you have a group that is committed to another vision of the national, Israel? And finally, the racial situation that culminated in the Holocaust. There you can't, your status cannot be changed. You are an enemy, you are racially fixed, you will pollute the non-Jews through intermarriage and assimilation. Therefore, for the Nazis, the only solution to the so-called Jewish problem was to get rid of the Jews, which they sought and almost succeeded in doing. Our situation today, and I'll just say one or two more words, and then we'll get to the meat of the session. Our situation today seems relatively new in that you use the language of morality and of political justice, human rights, in order, in fact, to delegitimate the Jews and, above all, their reborn state. All of this is focused on the state of Israel. It's a way of trying to destroy the state by engendering opposition to it from precisely those areas which in the past have supported Jews, the Enlightenment tradition. So you get something like Israel, Palestine must be free from the river to the sea. And that gets shouted all over the place these days. And it is genocidal. If you're going to have Palestine occupying the landmass from the river to the sea, you are destroying the state of Israel, which is the point. But you're coating it, you're giving it a veneer of morality. And in order to do this, of course, you have to be, you have to lie, you have to tell major lies and tell them again and again. And you have to do so with a smiling face. And the focus of this, the last point I'll make, where it differs from earlier anti-Semitisms, is the focus initially is on the university, and through the university on culture. This is not the place to go through the way in which a certain kind of Marxism, Frankfurt School Marxism, came to America through Marcuse and others, and through Gramsci, very importantly, the Italian cultural Marxist Gramsci. But the idea became we will come to power not through the working class, which is not interested, not through black people per se, they're not interested. We'll come to power through students. And it turns out, of course, there are millions of students, many of students coming from outside the United States, and they have proved, sadly, a fertile arena for the creation of ideologues devoted to anti-Semitism and to the destruction of Israel. We just saw yesterday, I'm in Washington, D.C. at the moment. We just saw yesterday 2 Jewish diplomats, members of the diplomatic corps, were executed at a Jewish museum at a soiree. A guy came in, his name was Rodriguez, and he killed 2 people. And the shockwaves of this are still reverberating. And he went to, he's a native-born American. He's not an immigrant. He went to the University of Illinois, I believe. I mean, the initial accounts are, as always, very sketchy, but he's an American. So the thing that's peculiar is there is a homegrown movement of Americans, seconded by, of course, students from the third world, et cetera, and financed by Qatar and by the Saudi Arabians and by China. And they are making headway. This fellow Rodriguez belongs to a small little group calling itself a party, the Party of Socialism and Liberty, if you can imagine that. I mean, the liberty part of it. So we were confronting something very real and very threatening, and it isn't going to go away in a hurry, and we have to marshal all our resources to combat it. And we're lucky to have with us today Professor Steinberg, who has created the NGO Monitor organization, which does yeoman's work in the interest of the Jewish people and of Israel. And I'll let him take it over at this point. Thanks.
Thanks, Fred. It's been thanks for the very nice introduction. And it's an honor for me to participate in this. I think I've been involved with you and CIJR for probably close to 20 years. And the work that you do is all of you do is extremely important, and I'm glad to be able to contribute. I want to pick up, well, to some degree where you left off. I think everything you said is a good introduction. I'll start with the picture because they say a picture's worth 1,000 words. The truth is I could probably go on for an hour. We could discuss just this picture, just this image. I'll show it quickly now. And as a start to what I'm going to be talking about and all the themes that you raised, this is a poster. So it was a poster in different forms, including on social media. This one version was on X or Twitter. It was also on Facebook and I think on Instagram, and it was also physically displayed by the most powerful organization. Really, these are the high priests of the religion of human rights, called Amnesty International. If you look at this image from January, it's a Christmas image. It's very blatant theological anti-Semitism. You look at the picture below, you look at the wording, end Israel's genocide against Palestinians in Gaza, and here we have a missile or perhaps a cross coming in and attacking these what they call the Jesus's family, Mary and Joseph and Jesus, and all the images that we have for 2,000 years of anti-Semitism are displayed in this picture that Amnesty International produced and promoted and advertised. And it is such a blatant example of an NGO, a non-governmental organization, and I'll talk about this later, but I'll just mention it now. They have an annual budget of 380 million euros a year, which is probably at least around over 500, a half a billion Canadian dollars a year. This is what they do in the name of human rights. It was founded by a Jew, 1961. I shouldn't go into the whole history of how this has been perverted by David Berenson. It was, and Amnesty was originally campaigning for the rights and the freedom of political prisoners, particularly behind the Iron Curtain in the Soviet bloc, but also elsewhere in other areas of the world. They were mostly volunteers. And now it's become the most influential superpower in the abuse of human rights for primarily demonizing Israel with old images of anti-Semitism combined with new images of anti-Semitism all together. They're not the only ones. It's a big industry, but they are in many ways the leading one. That's what we're up against. And I'll just read on the other side of what you're seeing here from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. We're talking about anti-Semitism. This is a document that was produced and became official, adopted by over almost 40 countries. Canada, interestingly enough, has formally is a member of the IHRA and has also adopted this the language of the two-page working definition of anti-Semitism. And here's one of the examples. This is the exact language. All right, this was actually written about 15 years ago, adopted almost 10 years ago, and it shows you what Amnesty is doing, using the symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism, example, claims of Jews killing Jesus or the blood libel, to characterize Israel or Israelis. That's what this image is, and that's what the industry does. So when we talk about the ways in which human rights and the language of human rights and the instruments of human rights and the institutions of human rights, it's not just Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, both of which are very prominent in Canada, often termed highly respected, but we track at NGO Monitor, the organization that I founded when I began to see this phenomenon 25 years ago. I'm never expecting it to reach this proportion. I thought this was going to be a 3-year project. And this is what is day-to-day products of this industry. It's repeated, adopted, increased, amplified by the United Nations. I think, Fred, you know, and probably many of the people who are watching this webinar know about Francesca Albanese, the United Nations Human Rights Council Special Rapporteur on Palestine and the rights of the, whatever it is they call it, the rights of the Palestinian people. Same language, same imagery, and in many other areas. It revolves, it gets, of course, reproduced in the media, and many other ways. So this gives you, I think, in one strong image, one strong example, the phenomenon that we have to deal with that really is at the core of spreading the image, the libel. It's a blood libel. Now, this is an image of genocide, but we have the same thing with starvation, and we have it with apartheid and the accusations, the day-to-day accusations of violations of international law and various other examples of that, crimes against humanity. All of these examples is very much the core now of the merger between what was supposed to be a guarantee of human rights, universal human rights. We'll talk about that later too, because this is clearly not universal. Singling out Israel, singling out the Jewish people for demonization.
Well, that's interesting. In listening to your presentation there, it struck again by the extent to which this is a new phenomenon in many ways. The idea that you can make a revolution because these people are revolutionaries, and that's the cry on campus: revolution, revolution, but revolution against the control of the world by the Jews. That's an old theme. There are certain old themes which pop up in new guises, of course. But the peculiarity is we're both university professors. We both understand much of what's happened in the last 30 years in universities. The movement today, this movement isn't exactly new. We saw a movement of student revolutionaries in 1968 and after. Right? We had the German Bader Gang. We had the Italian Brigate Rosse. My own field is Italian Renaissance history as well as anti-Semitism. So you had them in the States. You had the Weathermen. You had people killed in the States through bombings in the early 1970s. Right? One of Barack Obama's great friends was one of the Weathermen. Right?
And this was all the time of the Vietnam War. That was also part of the
yes, of course.
atmosphere.
But I was going to say, what happens is that the opponents of the Vietnam War become the leaders of this movement, and they learned one thing. They learned one thing from modern socialism, modern Marxism, particularly from Gramsci. I think Gramsci, Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci. He was killed by Mussolini, who put him in prison in 22, 23. But Gramsci was a student of Italian idealist philosophers like Benedetto Croce. And therefore, unlike the Germans and the Poles and the Hungarians, he knew something about, he had an instinctive feel for culture, for philosophy, literature. And he's living I won't go on too long, but he's living in Italy where the basic problem is not only political, it's the church, right? The church, and he discovers that the only way that you're going to make a revolution in Italy is if you can break the hold of the church, as he put it, over the proletariat. So you have to have a cultural war, okay? And he invents the idea of hegemonia ideologica, ideological hegemony, which will be picked up by Marcuse and the Frankfurt School and applied to the American situation in many ways, to the extent that, in fact, the class which will embody the revolution is no longer the working class, right? It's no longer the poor. It's no longer even blacks and brown people. It is students. They will do this, right? And they will do it by taking over the universities, capturing the university, and cranking out thousands and tens of thousands and even millions, finally, of ideologically oriented pro-revolutionary students. And
well, let me take it from a different direction. Let me add to what you're saying another layer, because I think that everything you said I agree with, but there's also the element going back to 1940, certainly starting in 1948 with the creation of Israel, and that's the Soviet Union, Stalin. And when we get to the universities, we'll talk about what's called post-colonialism. But there's a history here, and the same students today that are talking about Israel as apartheid, racist, genocidal, Zionism is racism, Israel has no right to exist, all very deeply created or developed within the, I would call it a pseudo-academic ideological framework, goes back to 1948. 1950s, Stalin, the doctor's plots, and a lot of other elements of that, of Soviet anti-Semitism, which was expressed in the United Nations. If you go through, and I don't encourage anybody to do that, there's some good books that have been written about this, that if the history of the United Nations and the Soviet bloc, it wasn't just the Soviet Union, it was echoed by East Germany and very much embraced by East Germans, the East German regime, but all the Eastern European Soviet regimes just stood behind and cheered or echoed what the Stalinist representatives said. So in meeting after meeting in the United Nations, in the institutions that were created after the Holocaust, in order to preserve, to guarantee, to promote universal human rights, the 1948 Universal Human Rights Declaration, which was adopted by almost every country in the world, became an instrument for demonizing Jews and Israel. If Israel's a racist, apartheid, genocidal state, already back then, how it becomes then for the slogans, the chants go through this history, and now they appear on campuses. So I just want to go through a couple of other points in this, because I think it's important to look at the historical development.
Good.
Roughly, first of all, I don't have the picture, I can show it, but I think everybody can see this. 1975 was the peak of this. The infamous United Nations resolution, General Assembly Resolution 3379, that declared Zionism is racism. This wasn't just the Soviet Union anymore and its constituents. This was a lot of African countries, a lot of Asian countries, and a lot of abstentions from Europe, from the democratic, what is supposed to be the democratic, liberal, progressive countries. They didn't use progressive in those days. So in 1975, we have this image of the UN ambassador, the Israeli ambassador to the UN, Chaim Herzog, current president's father, standing on the podium of the UN and ripping up this document that says Zionism is racism. And around this was also, again, the same language. And then the UN created a mechanism called, it's the Committee for the, something about the remembering of the Palestinian people, the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, called CIJR. And that committee, which met last week on Nakba Day, on May 9th, May 15th, goes around the world with NGO representatives speaking about Israel's being genocidal and racist, and that budget was created for that in 1975. And it kept, even though the resolution was repealed in 1991, the budget kept going and the framework kept going. So here we have a merger, we also see it in the United Nations Human Rights Council, between the NGOs with a huge amount of money. I mentioned Amnesty International. Human Rights Watch has an annual budget very similar to Amnesty, but based in the US, has an annual budget of 100 million US dollars a year. And they become superpowers. And when the Vietnam War ends and the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain disappear, they need a new agenda. What's out there already in the 1980s, 1990s? Vietnam's over. Oh, Israel. Israel is killing Palestinians. Israel occupies Palestinian land. Israel is the new colonialist power. We're going to focus all of our fundraising and public relations emphases. That's how we stay in business. And we show that we're powerful. And we're going to do this on campuses. And that's where post-colonialism comes in. I'll give you one example. Post-colonialism is the ideology that says that the West, the capitalist West, the liberal capitalist West, the democratic capitalist West, is responsible for all the evils of the rest of the world, of the suffering of the global South. They can't, Palestinians cannot commit war crimes because they're victims. And therefore, whatever they do, we're still going to embrace them as victims. And we see that every day. This I traced it back to the 1990s. You can go back a little bit earlier, even in the movements you discussed, the student movements. It wasn't, those did not really focus on Israel. It was shortly after 67 war, there was a little bit of that. But by the 1990s, it became a central theme. Then there was in 2001, you have the merger, the UN Human Rights Commission, in those days it was called, held a huge conference. South Africa, there was an NGO forum where the only significant resolution that was adopted, or plan of action, was the same language. Israel is guilty of apartheid, ethnic cleansing, genocide. And what is the prescription? The complete isolation of Israel as a genocidal apartheid state. That's the beginning of the BDS movement. It wasn't created by a Palestinian in 2004. It was done at the Durban conference. And then we see more and more steps, we can talk about those later, leading to where we are now, which is explosion. The explosion on campus after October 7th, 2023, did not come out of nowhere. It was well organized, it was well planned, it was well orchestrated, and it was well funded. You saw it in the US, you certainly saw it in Canada, you saw it in Europe. It's the same framework, and it was all led by NGOs, and we can talk about that as we go through. That's my historical background that I wanted to add the way you
Very good.
the information you put out there, because I think what we have is the merger of these two, like rivers that come together and create this overwhelmingly powerful and extremely dangerous and immoral movement.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing to track, and it's been done by several people, but to track the way in which the movement became ideological, captured students, then got funding from abroad, from various sources, which continues to this day. You know, when you look at pro-Palestinian demonstrations on campuses from the East Coast to the West Coast, from the North to the South, they're all carrying the same signs.
Yep.
The same slogans.
We'll talk about that. I'll give you examples in a minute.
Yeah,
And I'll tell you where they came from.
Yeah, it's remarkable. But going back to the UN, I would say, in a way, this is abstract, but when the UN was formed and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written, and each new member had to sign that,
Yes.
to agree to that. And then when they did not carry through in their own political theaters, they continued to be good members and good members in good standing. That was a crucial moment in which finally the UN becomes, it's really a sad paradox, but the UN becomes one of the key generators of anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism in the world. The head of the UN is an anti-Israel figure, and proud of it. I mean, that element of ideality, that you're a good person now if you turn against Israel. They have succeeded. I mean, we're still combating it, and we're going to defeat them. But to a certain extent, they've defeated. I have people calling me saying my Jewish kid is at Massachusetts Tech or whatever, and he's joining Jews for Palestine, and he's out there demonstrating, right? And I put him through Jewish schools here, and off he went to university. That is a general phenomenon, and that's going to be hard to deal with. It's going to be very hard. To me, as an academic, one of the key things that has to be done, and how to do it is a problem. The universities have to either be totally eliminated and replaced with healthy organisms, or somehow or other decently reformed. But they can't. The most recent thing is this woman Shipman, who may or may not be Jewish, I think she is, who's the acting president of Columbia. They had their graduation yesterday, 16,000 graduates. She stands up and says, we defend the Palestinians. We want to defend this Khalil Mahmoud, who's a pro-terrorist character and who is currently being held in Louisiana. We want him out. Free speech. They're fascists. This meme that starts with the extreme left of the U.S. as fascist and Hitler, Trump, for instance, is Hitler. I mean, we laugh at this to some extent, but given the general ignorance of the population when it comes to ideology, they take some of this seriously. They see very good people, heads of universities, seconding the vision of the anti-Semites. And a movement grows up and snowballs, right? That's where we are at the moment, I think.
I want to stick to in my
Yeah, go ahead.
lane.
Yeah,
Universities, I agree with you, are a huge problem. I do argue, and then the NGO Monitor just put out a first part of a report. We did it on Harvard, in the way in which the NGOs, we focus on the NGOs. I saw this movement taking place in the work that I was doing in other realms. I went to some of these conferences in the UN on different issues and was handed out brochures by NGOs about Israeli war crimes. This was in 2000, 2001. And the Durban conference I was aware of and was involved in but didn't actually go, that would reach the peak at that point, that the NGOs were infiltrating. They were becoming, in many ways, the movers and shakers. Now, we just did a study of how many NGO contacts and links there are at Harvard. Some of the worst, most anti-Israel, anti-Semitic frameworks at Harvard are also very much characterized by people from the NGO world. The faculty, fellows, visiting scientists, we went through a lot of these are pseudo-academic programs in human rights. The Carr Center, now called the Carr Ryan Center for Human Rights at the John F. Kennedy School for Public Policy of Harvard. Harvard is this huge conglomerate, right? We don't know where the funding comes from, by the way. I wouldn't be surprised if it was the same places that the university gets billions from Qatar,
right,
and some of
right,
it may
exactly.
get into this area as well. They also had a school for public health, where they have a number of fellows and a couple of real faculty members and a lot of what I call marginal or adjunct faculty members whose entire lives are devoted to NGOs. University of Toronto, we haven't looked at McGill yet. I wouldn't be surprised if that was there. But the University of Toronto, they wanted to hire a few years ago a woman whose entire qualification was based on bashing Israel. She worked for an organization called Al-Haq and has a whole history. And they wanted to hire her to run their human rights clinic. And thankfully, the university decided that that was not the appropriate thing to do. And there was a huge outcry. This was interfering with free speech. I was accused, having sent this woman's CV and her complete lack of educational qualifications to members of the faculty and deans. I was accused, of course, of trying to suppress Palestinian rights. But all I was doing was pointing out that when you hire someone in a university position where you're supposed to be doing research and you're supposed to be doing honest, straightforward, honest maybe not the appropriate term, but there are normative, principled, verifiable research and
Honest is pretty
analysis.
good. Yeah,
And you take people from whose whole lives have been based on NGO propaganda, totally bashing Israel, totally demonizing Israel through exactly the terms we're talking about. That's not a form that's appropriate for any academic framework. So we're doing a study of that. I'm going to keep to that because that's where my expertise comes from.
well, I
Knowledge
agree
that
with
I have.
the key role of the NGOs. On the other hand, they infiltrate the universities. And it's no accident that they do political polling of academics, professors, under 3-4% are in any sense moderate or conservative. The universities have been taken
That's
over
another aspect. Yeah.
liberals, radicals, progressives, quote unquote. This has gone on now for almost 30 years, as you're pointing out. And that is a major problem. There's nothing like it before in Western history, that the universities, I mean, this is such a rich topic. Mass society emerges, liberal representation, people have rights, people stop being educated, but the whole structure increasingly has been taken over by a movement which is inimical to the very elements which fostered university in the first place. Right? Universities, if I had university-age children today, I wouldn't send them to the major universities. I would do a lot of research and try and find out where they can get a decent curriculum. But English departments have become one of the great conduits for radical Marxism. I mean, it's an incredible thing. And now it's beginning to affect the STEMs, the STEM sciences, STEM disciplines as well.
Not nearly as much, at least not yet.
No, it's not
But
yet.
they do get swept. Some of them do get swept away. But I would also say there's a pushback. There is criticism. And Steven Pinker, for instance, at Harvard, is one of the people who says this is, when you have people who are well-known, significant academics, Carrie Nelson has written a lot about this. There are a number of people. So I think that in the academic world, there's a growing awareness. And my contribution to that is say, let's look at NGOs, because NGOs, let me say a few words about the NGO world
Yeah,
for people who
please.
are
Yeah,
not aware of that. I started off with the example of Amnesty International. I mentioned Human Rights Watch. When I started doing the research on this 25 years ago and writing about this from a political science perspective, not so much of a science, from a political studies perspective, what is their influence in international politics, which nobody had ever looked at before? I thought this was going to be, I'll look at Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and some of the better known organizations, and that would be it. Turns out that the organization, NGO Monitor, and I should add, we have 17 full-time staff members. And we're not able to keep up with all the work. There are layers of, like archaeology, because this goes down to the center of the earth. There are layers after layers after layers. There are the superpowers, and there are a few more like that, like the one that I just mentioned, like the ones I just mentioned in Europe. I won't go through the whole list again. But and then there are the Palestinian and Israeli organizations, particularly Palestinian ones that are linked to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Palestinian terrorists, Marxists, pseudo-Marxists, had this great idea in the 1990s, and actually some of them earlier, that if they called themselves a human rights organization and they became members through the United Nations, what's called ECOSOC status, so they could speak in the Human Rights Council and various other platforms as human rights organizations and talk about Israeli apartheid and genocide and starvation and violation of human rights and war crimes and all of that. And they were absolutely right. That was a great ticket, and they got lots of money. Most of their money comes from European governments. Canada used to be part of that, and I think, well, actually now has gone back
it
into
is.
that business.
It is.
We
Yes,
just,
indeed.
I'll tell you, I want to spend some time talking about Canada in a few minutes because there's now more and more evidence that's been largely hidden, but comes out to the UN that through the United Nations, Canada is paying terrorists to talk about what is supposed to be women's rights, and all they do with the money is they're bombarding Israel. They're the eighth front of this war, this evil war and this is Canadian money. And there are other examples. So this was a clever move. Non-governmental organizations are supposed to be non-governmental. First of all, sometimes they're called civil society organizations. As soon as they get money from a government, any government, they're no longer non-governmental organizations. Why do European governments give money to Al-Haq and all sorts of other groups, of Palestinian Center for Human Rights? Why does Canada, through the UN, have their money? I bet that we'll get an answer. We're going to write a letter to Global Affairs, Foreign Ministry of Canada, and ask them why their money goes there. And they'll probably say, we give the money to the UN, and the UN decides where the money goes, which won't surprise me because that's a real serious problem. You're giving millions of taxpayer money and you don't decide where it goes. It goes to hate while you say it's not my problem. NGOs are supposed to be non-governmental, supposed to be civil society. They're mostly supposed to be volunteer, altruistic organizations, like Amnesty was back in 1961, like Oxfam was back at the end of World War II, like so many other groups. And they have become very much, not just a big business, they've become a very unregulated industry with no oversight, huge amounts of money going in, and much of that comes from governments.
That's something we have to look at as
Yeah,
we
well, that's what we've been doing, and I encourage
yes,
people to look at
as we
the
enter the
NGO Monitor website because we've got over 300 groups that are listed there,
good.
and each country has a database. We've
Right.
been doing this for 25 years. We got, as I said, 17 people. This is what we do. And these organizations, they'll write reports as experts, but they're not experts. What we talked about earlier, they're ideologues, they're campaigners, and they've never been in a war. They have no idea what they're talking about when they talk about war crimes. They have no idea what they're talking about international humanitarian law. They have no idea how, in the middle of a very brutal war, you can provide food and support for the population, called siege warfare. They don't care about that. All they want to do is paint a black and white picture. Palestinians are good victims. Israelis are evil aggressors. They are the version of the colonialist attackers. All the history of colonialism, Western colonialism, is being dumped on this tiny little country in Israel that's trying to survive.
Even
That's what
so,
the NGOs do.
yeah. Even so, it's not just that the Americans are the little Satan. There's a big Satan. I'm sorry, the Israelis
The
are
Israelis are a little right.
the Americans are the big Satan. This movement is anti-Western. That's the incredible thing. It's
Yeah,
occurring in one of the great achievements of Western civilization, which is the university, which didn't exist before the Middle Ages. And they're boring in from the inside out, and they want to destroy it. And they say that publicly. They say it publicly.
yeah.
Down with the West. The West is evil. Now, I think as we enter the second half of this seminar, two things I'd like us to focus on. One thing I think is a great concern, and that is the increasing turn to violence. I think that should be underlined. The movement is creating, for reasons which we can discuss, activists very similar but much larger in numbers to the radicals of the 60s, late 60s and early 70s. More and more people are being killed. The Jews were killed in a synagogue in Chicago. The people yesterday, all kinds of terrible things going on. Nothing like it has been seen in the United States. This is partially a movement, as we've indicated, to delegitimate not just Israel and the Jews, but to delegitimate the West and the West's major supporter at this point, the United States. They're out to destroy the United States, which seems absurd, but it is very dangerous. Very dangerous. They tried to kill Trump twice, at least twice. And evidently there are still Iranian agents out somewhere in the US plotting to assassinate Trump. When it comes to the reform of the universities, I would like to say that all the work that we do here at CIJR, your good work with NGO Monitor, and a number of other outfits which are very good. And I often dream that we could connect them all together so that we would have some kind of WOMP, some international WOMP.
We are working together.
We're working together. That's right. Yes. But
Hillel Neuer at UN Watch, people at UN Watch, they do tremendous work. Honest report.
Hillel came out of CIJR partially.
I know.
Yeah.
I met him first in Montreal.
Oh, really? That's
yes.
Nice.
About 20 years ago, we were at an event together and went to a baseball game back in those days. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so we should keep our eyes open. This is a very vast movement. It's well financed. All right, you can move from the Soviet Union prior to 70 through 73 down to Qatar, Iran, China, you name it today. There are billions of dollars coming in. University programs have been suborned, particularly in Middle East studies, but not only, right? And it's becoming more and more violent. And why this is, I think, is worth some thought. Not at the moment, but perhaps we can devote another seminar to this. The Verbindung, the connection between this idealistic anti-idealism and the turn to violence, on the other hand. Okay. And the second thing I think we should try and do in the remaining time is to look at the actual technique for combating the NGOs. That's something that you guys have been working on hard and doing great work. And we really want to hear what you've been doing and what your ideas are. So those two things we can.
Okay. I'm going to start with the second one.
Okay.
I think there again, I have something more substantive to say. My experience has been that trying to convince people who are deeply committed to the NGO agenda and all the ideology that you've talked about are not open to serious discussion or argument. So I, as someone who does politics and sees power as a form of gravity, that it runs just like gravity dominates the universe, money dominates the what's called the human rights movement, and particularly the NGOs and their infiltration of universities, their role in governments, all of that. So what we do at NGO Monitor, a lot of what we do is we try to track and expose where the money goes. These organizations which spout these very idealistic principles, they don't tell you where their money comes from. So Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Amnesty's got this very convoluted group. And I wonder if there's, maybe not at this point for CIJR, but I often will give talks, particularly to students or later people who are further on in their lives and careers. The older people will tell us, I used to be a member of Amnesty. I used to donate every year. Now I'm embarrassed and ashamed. Some students say, I'm part of Amnesty. Amnesty has a chapter on campus. I want to be part of that. What's wrong with that? Some of those people you can convince, but the people who run the org, they don't know how those people are chosen, how the agenda is made. It's Amnesty International, with its budget of 380 million euros a year. I got to keep raising that, for over 500 million Canadian dollars, has a corporate structure registered in the UK, which nobody from the outside can fathom or figure out, including accountants I've talked to. So they can hide where the money comes from. They can hide how they choose their leaders and everything else. And it's all a very closed box under the facade of promoting liberal, progressive values and ideas and democratic ideas. So, having given that introduction, our basic approach is follow the money. Follow the NGO money. In each country, in each situation, where does the budget come from? And a lot of it, like I said, is hidden. So we'll start with the money that is visible. And then we work our way further beyond that. I'm going to give you an example of something. I'll put this on now, which is related. Follow the money, but also, where possible, put spokes in the wheels. So you mentioned all the activities that are going on campus. And now, there's an organization called Semidun, which is a front for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. It's an NGO. The head of it was a terrorist, a Palestinian terrorist who was expelled from Israel. And he set up shop in Germany. And in dozens of campus, they're not protests, right? These are violent mobs. You talked about the violence. And where the term genocide and everything else is used, where they stop and intimidate anybody connected with Israel, anybody Jewish. They won't let speakers speak. Semidun is a central part of that. They're linked to and closely work with not just Students for Justice for Palestine. They co-sponsor events or vice versa, with Independent Jewish Voices, which you've probably heard of, a Canadian organization. Semidun was thrown out of Germany because of the terror connections and because of their anti-Semitism about 2 years ago. Where did they set up shop? In Vancouver. And they were organizing violent, they call them demonstrations, protests. Throughout Canada, on Canadian campuses, you would see their flags, their slogans, often with groups that are called Students for Justice for Palestine and other frameworks like that. Well, having worked on this for a year, over more than that, questioning and sending material to members of parliament, very often our Canadian allies would take this material that we have on the role of Semidun and the fact that they were thrown out of Germany and bring it to the attention of members of parliament in Canada. Anthony Housefather, who I think, as you may know, in your area, was one of the from the Liberal Party, but he raised this repeatedly, and I have to say, somewhat surprisingly, on October 15th, the Canadian government, this was still under Justin Trudeau, and in parallel with the United States on exactly the same day, coordinated, listed Semidun as designated as a terrorist front for the PFLP. A central part of what we saw on the campuses, an NGO based in Vancouver, was shut down and labeled as a sham charity. Right? That's an important language. That's what the Canadian, this is a statement from Public Safety Canada that was issued, and a very detailed explanation of why they were no longer able to be recognized as a NGO, a legitimate NGO in Canada. So that's an example where not just shutting down the funding, they cannot raise money anymore, but they cannot operate in that framework. And I think that's an important element in the process. We find the areas where the organizations are most blatant in their hatred, in their calls for violence, and their links to terrorism. And through a lot of work with a lot of allies, show that these are not appropriate or within the legal framework. It
Yeah, but
happened,
you're,
as I said, in Germany, the US, and Canada. That's one example, and it's an important example, and we can go on from there. Go ahead.
I was just going to say the examples you've used, and particularly the Samidun, they show you the role of power as you're noting it. They have power. They have money.
Well, they had power, yes.
They had power, and in one area they didn't succeed. In other areas they succeed.
They had power through the universities, through the intellectuals, through the media. They were not able to sustain that when confronted with.
Even corporations, right? There have been the record of donations of corporations to these outfits is not yet written. Perhaps you've done work on that.
Well,
Okay?
I'll get to that in a second, but in the case of Semidun, probably came from offshore.
Okay.
Probably,
The point I want to make is we're looking at power, and we're also looking at another phenomenon which I think is underestimated. And I put this in quotation marks, but they constitute a kind of a new religion. They are in a way a cult. There's a cultic
which is
dimension.
why we focus on where their claims and their image of being a
Yes,
cult or
that's great work.
promoting human rights are, and the reality of where they are, what they do, how they do it, where their sources of income, all of that, where the two clash. And occasionally, it took a couple of years, but occasionally, with enough pressure, the hypocrisy of considering them in that category versus the reality, at some point it bursts. Let me show you another example
Okay,
of how we do this, because I think it's important for people to see this. This is an example here of, I will say, the Canadian government provided a lot of money to these organizations up until around 2008, 2009. And there's Stephen Harper, John Baird, and others, having seen the reports that we wrote, they closed down. It was called CIJR, the Canadian International Development Agency, and it was shut down. It now exists within global affairs. I'll talk in a minute about the Canadian aspect. I think Canadians should see how much money has been restored. It's gradually being restored, as I said, usually through the end, usually blindly. But one of the ways to reduce their power, I'll take the example of Europe. Okay, we have, by providing information, hard, open source data that can be independently verified in country by country through members of parliament, through journalists that understand the issues, not always easy to find. We've cut back, the governments have cut back on the order of $30 million a year to the NGO industry. That is probably only a third of what they were getting, but it's still significant. They've had to lay off people and reduce their, this is in the last year, certainly after October 7th, they realized the dangers of this. Foundations that are very generous, the Open Society Institute, which is George Soros's framework, hundreds of millions of dollars go to NGOs. Rockefeller Brothers, which provided millions of US dollars to organizations designed to create a divide between American Jews and Israel. The Ford Foundation, which originally sponsored a large part, along with the Canadian government, of the Durban Conference in 2001 and the NGO Forum. So all of those frameworks have gradually been forced to cut back their funding. What we have not been able to do yet, and that's going to take a lot more pressure, is when the money comes from Iran and Qatar. It also comes, by the way, through anonymous funding from major brokerages. So you have hundreds of millions of dollars, and it also goes to Chinese-supported NGOs, not just the Israel issue, but it's also the ones that are trying to promote China as a good international partner and promote trade. They pour a lot of money into their NGOs. So, and a lot of that money gets funneled through Goldman Sachs and other philanthropic funds, so you can't always trace where it comes from. So the regulations, and this is the point I want to get at for Canada and the US, but we're talking to a Canadian audience. The charity frameworks, Revenue Canada, that provides these frameworks and does not have provisions for revealing, for forcing transparency, for foreign government funding to an organization that exists within the Canadian tax framework as a nonprofit, as an NGO, or as whatever definition is used. Sometimes, as I said, they're called civil society organizations. The fact that they do not have to disclose the sources of their funding when they're from foreign governments is a serious, serious lack of I think, democratic principles. Because, as I said, they have these huge budgets and they're able to really manipulate public opinion on campuses and elsewhere. So that's what I think, at least one of the ways that it's important to act. I'm going to just talk a little bit about Canada for a second. I guess I got to stop. There it
Go
is.
ahead. Go ahead.
This is one particular example. Human Rights Watch. These are independent, legally independent frameworks that raise money for, I talked about Amnesty and Human Rights Watch. Amnesty raises $12 million a year in Canada. We don't know where it goes or how it's used, whether it's used in Canada or outside. And the, wait a minute, yeah, that's right, that was the total. And after you reduce their fundraising expenses, Human Rights Watch raises less. It's only $3 million in Canada in the last year. But that money all gets used, or significant amounts of it get used, to attack, to demonize, Israel, to promote anti-Semitism. So there are real questions. Do the same question in the United States. Here's an example of how Canadian money, Canadian government money comes in. Here, I'll give you just a few examples here. If you look at the Canadian budget, some of it is publicly available. You have to dig a little bit, and we've got people who work with us on that. And they provided, after they pledged a lot of money after October 7th for Palestinian, supporting the poor victims in Palestine, Palestinian humanitarian aid. Where does a lot of that money go? It goes to organizations that don't do humanitarian aid. They do anti-Israel propaganda of the kind we've talked about. And my guess is that nobody, either somebody within the Canadian government framework knows exactly who they're going to and doesn't talk about it, or the people who sign off on it don't bother to look. Oh, they say they do Palestinian agricultural relief. Let's give them money. They do United Agricultural Workers Committee. The first item on this is a PFLP, just like Al-Haq and the other groups, and like Semidoun, it's a PFLP front organization. They provided, and in other examples, I won't go through all of them, that sound good, Palestinian Medical Relief Society, but they do demonization, genocide, apartheid, what leads to violence. One more quick example here, 13.77 million immediately pledged to the Humanitarian Coalition for Gaza. A lot of that money went to something called Islamic Relief Canada. They are part of Islamic Relief Worldwide, which Israel designates as a terrorist organization, directly funding Hamas. And the State Department, U.S. State Department, back in 2021 said the same thing. Well, is the Canadian government that provides us money, did they consider this? Did they ignore it? Did they not even know about it? How is the decision-making process made in funding what is supposed to be humanitarian relief? So I have more examples, but basically they all end up the same, so I'll stop there. And that, to me, is, in a practical, realistic way, it's not going to win the battle of ideas that you talk about, but it does significantly impact on their power and holding each government accountable. It's your tax dollars that's going to these organizations. And if they're not being properly vetted, if there's no due diligence, are they connected to terrorism? Do they do hate propaganda? They do anti-Semitism? Then why are you giving them money? I think that has proven to be quite effective in our limited realm.
Yeah, that limited realm is crucially important. And one has to take every possibility into account and deal with it. and move on different fronts at the same time. But it would be nice
Absolutely.
some coordination in all of that. The thing that I would like to say in conclusion, since we're coming close to ending, um, everything you talk about involves something that you yourself have emphasized, and that is power, power. And it seems to me that at the end of the day, to use that easy expression, at the end of the day, um, America is crucial. America is crucial to Israel. Um, America has to overcome this situation. And Trump, therefore, becomes a focal point, Trump. And it seems to me that you can affect change through institutions in several ways, but one of them is from the top down. Trump uses so far, he is using state power, right? He has a majority in Congress. Uh, he's dominant, and he's used state power to attack anti-Semitism on the universities. He has taken $2 billion so far away from Harvard in terms of grants, 400 to 600 million from Columbia. And
Taxpayer money.
that's fair money, yeah. And taxpayer money. That's real money. And that seems to be able to nudge these outfits, to overcome their leftist ideological inertia. And we should understand that the people running these places now, the presidents of these universities, many of the board of trustees, they're produced by the very system which we're trying to dislodge. And therefore they are not, they're not open to change, really. They don't accept it themselves. They try to sabotage it wherever possible. But in one sense, the change can come from the top down. And I think that this business of the ideological pro-Palestinian, pro-Islamic terrorism movement as a kind of religion, as a kind of cult, is reflected in I don't want to get us into the weeds here, but it's reflected in what's called the Trump derangement syndrome. And that's connected to a point you made earlier about these people are not changeable. You can't deal with them. They're hard and fast committed to what they see. And I think that's true. Trump derangement syndrome, I think, is a real psychological problem. And I think it extends more broadly to the American world, in which one party has in fact become the party of Marxism and the party of Islam, pro-Islamism, and the terrible rent, terrible tear in the American political fabric there. And
Yeah,
that,
but I think we have to be careful. I want
yeah,
to be careful. The issues that we deal with of anti-Semitism, attacks against Jews on universities, in cities, in Jewish neighborhoods in Montreal, Toronto, and elsewhere, I think it's important not to get locked into a particular political party framework or leadership.
I agree.
They have to be, they have to be more broadly. So you've got in Canada just elected another liberal government, and I would hope that Mark Carney, with his experience, Mark Carney has visited Israel when he was in the central banking position. He does not have a history before he got into politics of being hostile to Israel. I've talked to people who have met with him from here, from Israel. I'm not as optimistic about his new foreign minister, used to be the defense minister. I don't know what she knows at all about the reality, but I think the case has to be made. And as much pressure put on them, you don't want to be Trump? That's fine. We understand that. But that does not mean that you have to do everything the opposite of what Trump does. And the Canadian government, if it wants to be consistent with the principles, the liberal principles, Liberal Party principles, and also I started and I want to end with what I talked about earlier, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism, which Canada has adopted. And that's something that I think needs to be stressed. In addition to power, in parallel, yeah, we're going to put pressure on you, but at the same time, you also, there's a set of values that you have committed to. committed to distinguishing between legitimate criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. Statements that have been made the last couple of days, not echoing what is done in France and Britain. The Canada, Britain, and France came up with this horrible, just 2 days ago, attack against Israel, not saying we have a solution to the problem of providing aid in Gaza that will not be stolen by Hamas and used for terrorism, but simply condemning Israel. That feeds anti-Semitism. It's an excuse for violence. Adopting the IHRA working, not just adopting rather, but being reminded and using them. Don't, if an organization like the NGOs we've talked about commits itself, is involved centrally in anti-Semitism, it shouldn't get funding from it. Certainly not from the Canadian government. Use those examples, and also universities.
If you look at the definition, the IHRA, one of the key differences between earlier definitions is the notion that criticism of Israel as a genocidal state is illegitimate and equals anti-Semitism.
Yes.
If that one element were taken seriously in Canada and elsewhere, we wouldn't have what we have in on
Which
campus.
is why I end on that point. I always want to emphasize that, because I think
I would agree. No one party has a monopoly on virtue or what is right, but what does count is will. You can have statements of all kinds that you have at the UN. Or read the UN Charter. It's wonderful. Look at the UN reality. Not so great. I mean, even the Soviet Union was closer to its constitution of 36 than the UN is to its founding charter.
So maybe the same distance, which is infinite.
Yeah. So I think we should take that into account. And I think that in America, this rending apart of the parties, the two-party system, where one party, in fact, now no longer appeals to a broad spectrum of the population, but increasingly to a narrower base, is very dangerous. I think it's very dangerous. And I do hope that a new kind of Democratic Party will emerge that looks around and says, this has been insanity. Let's get back on the beam.
I'll leave that to you and other guests that you bring on. That's out of my.
We each have enough on our plate, right?
That's
in
right.
Israel, in Canada,
I stick
and
to
the US.
Right, exactly. I stick in my lane as much as possible.
This is wonderful. Great to see you and to have
Good
you
to
on.
see you, and
I'm
thank
sure
you.
that people watching this will deeply appreciate what you're doing. Take care,
Thank
Gerald.
you. Good to see you. Bye-bye.
Bye.